Well, all right, guys, I'm so glad you're here for this video. I'm really excited about this one, and I've been excited about the whole Psalm 23 series, and I hope you're being blessed by it. And thank you, all of you who support the channel through your prayers and your finances. I really appreciate it. And so let's begin by reading the whole Psalm. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Now the verse we are going to be looking at in this video. Psalm 23:3, the last half. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And you know what? I think this is a necessary balance for what we saw last week when we focused on the cast down sheep and dug into the parable of the prodigal son. We looked at the gracious, loving response of the father when the wayward child returned home. And we saw how comforting that was. It taught us that it's safe to go home even after an extended period of sin. That we will be met by our Father who is not holding grudges and who is willing to forgive and restore. I mean, the prodigal son thought he would be met with anger. Instead, he was welcomed with kisses. What grace that parable teaches. So, it's safe to go home no matter how much you've blown it. But here's the problem, I think. We tend to swing from one extreme to another. And our flesh is skilled at taking hold of things like the Father's willingness to forgive and use it as an excuse to sin. Well, I guess sin is no big deal then. I mean, that's great. I can sin it up and then just be forgiven. It seems like God doesn't care. So in this video, we have the balance that God expects holiness and sin is a big deal and will lead us then onto those paths of righteousness. So today, we're looking at the idea of the paths of righteousness. And paths speak of movement, don't they? We are moving from one place to another. And we'll see why that movement is important as we work our way through this study. So let's start with the sheep, then we'll look at what it means to us. First, we need to see that sheep are creatures of habit. And not all their habits are good, which means if they are left to themselves, they will repeatedly do things that will harm them, such as following the same trail until it becomes a hardened rut, or they'll graze on the same area in the pasture until it is destroyed, eating the grass all the way down to the roots. And if left in the same pasture for too long, they will pollute the ground until it is filled with disease and parasites. The point is, if left to themselves, they will ruin beyond repair what was once a lush green pasture, creating an unhealthy environment which results in sickness and disease. So the shepherd must disrupt the natural habits of the sheep to keep this from happening. And the way he does this is he keeps them on the move. Every few days, he will move them to fresh pastures to keep them from destroying the land through overgrazing. It also kept the parasites from causing disease. The sheep would be moved before the parasites that were found in their waste could hatch. And by the time they returned, those parasites would be dead, and the environment would be healthy again. So the Good Shepherd had this predetermined plan to keep the sheep on the move. And none of it was by accident. He would have already investigated the fields around them, and he knew exactly which ones had the proper vegetation for the sheep to feed upon. He also knew what pastures contained plants that could be poisonous. So there was no guesswork in any of this. It was all planned out with precision because the sheep's health depended upon the shepherd guiding them wisely. But the sheep trusted the shepherd's guidance and willingly followed him. And they get so excited when he led them to a fresh pasture. I think this is so cute. Even the older ewes would kick up their heels and leap with delight. Well, that's for the sheep. Now let's turn to the believer, because this is an analogy about human sheep, isn't it? And the first thing we want to see here is human sheep are creatures of habit also. Just like the sheep we've been looking at, whose habits weren't physically healthy, we can develop habits that aren't always spiritually healthy. Just like those sheep, the believer can follow their own ways, even to their own harm. I mean, we have a dangerous ability to somehow convince ourselves that our repeated actions won't have consequences, that we'll be fine. But fortunately, the Lord loves us and will not let us settle for that. He has come to give us the abundant life, hasn't he? That's John 10:10. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So when he sees those bad habits forming in us, he will do what the shepherd did with the sheep. He will do whatever is necessary to disrupt how we are living. He will do whatever it takes to move us onto those paths that lead to righteousness, godliness, and spiritual health. And in the context of Psalm 23, those are the paths that lead to green pastures and still waters, right? Where we experience the life that is full of joy, peace, contentment, and satisfaction. So he presents us with these paths, a different way to go. He may speak to our hearts through the word, or in a sermon, or through a friend, but we sense our shepherd is speaking to us. He may be confronting us, convicting us about a sin in our life, or calling us to something new, maybe to a deeper commitment. This moving can come in so many different ways. He may use adversity to redirect us like we saw last week with the prodigal son. But when he begins to move us, like those sheep, we're going to have to trust our shepherd's leading. In other words, this is going to take faith, isn't it? Why? Because his paths don't always look easy. They may not always be comfortable. He may be confronting habits that we want to keep. He may be calling us to commit to something we'd rather not do. Or he may be putting his finger on a sin we don't want to give up. So, what do? Well, we must think rather than just react. We must remind ourselves that these paths our shepherd calls us onto lead to those green pastures and the abundant life. They lead to where we really want to go. But now listen, because I think we forget an important detail here. That life, the abundant life, the blessed life, flows straight through Christ-likeness. In other words, the more we're like him, the more we experience his life flowing in us and through us, and that life is the abundant life. But the reason we might hesitate to step onto those paths is this means the flesh that is not like him must be cut away. John 15:1 and 2 says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. He prunes. And that cutting away of the flesh, man, that can be painful, can it? Destructive habits die hard. So, because of this reality, the danger is, rather than going God's way, rather than stepping onto those paths that lead to greater righteousness, we choose our own path, a path that leads away from God, righteousness, and the abundant life he wants us to experience. We move away from those green pastures where contentment and satisfaction flourish. See, the truth is, that life Jesus came to give us, that life of peace and joy, that life that has life in it, is only experienced when we follow him, right? He is leading us that way, but we must follow him to get there. But let's be honest. As I look around the Christian body, it seems so few are experiencing this life the Bible promises. So few seem to be joy-filled and really satisfied and content. So few seem to be resting in his loving care. Well, why? Well, can I suggest that they are insisting on their own way, and that's the reason why? They are choosing their own paths rather than following him onto his. And what amazes me, and I've seen this so many times, is they get bitter at God because their Christianity isn't turning out like they thought it would. They accuse him of letting them down. Well, where are all the blessings the Bible promises? Abundant life? I don't think so. They'll even resent other Christians who they see getting blessed. Why do they have so much joy when I'm so miserable? They're like sheep standing in a pasture of their own choosing, looking over to those who have followed the shepherd into a greener pasture that is filled with blessings, and they resent them. You and your perfect little life. All your joy, all your peace, everything is just wonderful for you, isn't it? And look at me, my lousy, stinking life. Look at me. And again, can I suggest that most of the time, the difference is a willingness to trust, obey, and follow. One is enjoying the blessings God has led them into. The other is eating the fruit of their own ways. And listen to Proverbs 129 through 31. This is not the way you want to go. Because they hated knowledge, didn't choose to fear the Lord, were not interested in my counsel, and rejected all my correction, they will eat the fruit of their way and be glutted with their own schemes. So what do we have so far? We have seen we are creatures of habit and will do those habits even when they're not spiritually healthy. And unless our shepherd disrupts those natural tendencies, we will continue to do things that lead us away from Christ and destroy our spiritual passion. So, because he loves us, he intervenes in our life and moves us onto those paths of righteousness that lead to those green pastures. But like we saw, we're not always easy to move, are we? We don't always desire his ways like we should. And that brings us to our next section. And fortunately, there is something we can do about that. Something that will increase our desire for his ways. So I want to finish by looking at 4 necessary shifts in our attitude that will help us to be willing to move. And so this section is attitudes that allow us to be moved. The first one is this: stop focusing on you alone. Now, you know what? I know that's not easy. Bernard Bailey said this: when science discovers the center of the universe, a lot of people will be disappointed to find they are not it. But when we're the center of everything, everything becomes about us. It's all about my comfort, my pleasure, my time, and my finances. So if that's how we're thinking, we can create a habit of being willing to reject God's way when those things I just mentioned are threatened. And to protect them, we will choose things that pamper the flesh and lead to spiritual coldness, apathy, and indifference. The solution is this: fix our focus on Christ and his kingdom. Put him first, because when he's first, then we will choose what he wants for us. We will be willing to step onto those paths of righteousness. So our choices will then begin to move us ever closer to him, closer to the flame where our heart is ignited. But how do I do that? What will help me choose those ways that may be contrary to what I want to do? Those ways that look more difficult than the way I want to go. Well, Jesus told us something that is very important, something that will help us a lot, and I believe this is one of the most important passages in the Bible. Look at Matthew 6:19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So there is our shepherd pointing to a path of righteousness that is incredibly powerful, a way that will naturally draw our heart towards him and heaven, a way to be more spiritually minded. So how does this work? Well, it's actually very simple. And I'll use the stock market as an example. And because Elon Musk is in the news all the time now, let's use Tesla stock. Now, I'm not Tesla minded. Why? Because I have nothing invested in Tesla. I have no treasure there. Therefore, I never think about how they're doing. They're not on my radar at all. But if I was regularly putting treasure into Tesla stock, what would happen? I would naturally become Tesla-minded. I'd be checking how they were doing all the time. I'd be interested. And it's the same thing spiritually. If I want to focus less on me and more on Jesus in heaven, in other words, if I want to be more heavenly minded or spiritually minded, then Jesus says the path that leads there is through putting some treasure there. And this is why it's so important we choose wisely what our treasure is, right? Because our heart follows it. If my treasure is in heaven, then my heart will be there also. It will be caught up and thrilled by Christ and his ways. But if my focus is on me and the comfort of the world, then my heart will become more and more worldly. So this path of righteousness is all about putting treasure in heaven. Well, how do we do that? Well, we do that by committing our resources, our money, time, and talents to the work of Christ in this world. And let me encourage you, the more you walk that path, the more attractive God's will becomes. Why? Because you're being led into those green pastures, right? Where you experience that life Jesus came to give you. That life of joy, peace, satisfaction, and contentment, or what we've been calling the abundant life. So we can't fix our focus only on us. Our focus should be on Christ. Second, We must be willing to stand alone if we want to be free from stagnation. Why? Because those paths of righteousness God may call us to will not always be applauded by others. He may call you to do things your family, friends, neighbors, and co-workers will think is crazy. I think of Martin Lloyd-Jones, a powerful Bible teacher who ministered in London from 1939 to 1968. But before being called to the ministry, he was an extremely successful surgeon. In fact, so successful, he was in line to become the royal surgeon, next in line, a position most doctors could only dream of. But God had other plans for him. He called him to give up surgery to enter the ministry. Now, can you imagine the reactions of those he knew? Wait, you have a chance to become the doctor in England, the royal surgeon, and you're going to give that all up to be a minister? I mean, you're so successful. How do you know that ministry thing you think you're being called into will be? I mean, it's crazy. But God knew what he was doing. Martin Lloyd-Jones became the teacher in London, and the teachings from his pulpit powerfully reverberated around the world. And he touched so many more lives with a Bible in his hand than he ever could holding a scalpel. The point is, he had a choice, didn't he? And it's the same choice we all have, to please God or please man, to choose the path of righteousness that leads to blessing or take the easier path that pleases others, makes you more popular maybe, but ends up leading to spiritual stagnation and indifference. The Bible warns us about fearing what man thinks. Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. So you start making spiritual decisions based on what man thinks of you, and that's going to hinder you spiritually. Instead of following God into blessing, you are going to be led by man into spiritual dullness. You trade in God's power for popularity, and that is a lousy exchange. Well, this leads us to our third point, which builds on the one we just saw. Third, to escape stagnation, we can't be afraid to move out of the comfort zone. Now let's define what the comfort zone is. I look at the comfort zone as something we settle into that protects us from any kind of risk, a mentality that keeps us from doing anything new or difficult. Now, the problem with the comfort zone is you just stop advancing and growing. You kind of hunker down and settle for stagnation. So rather than taking ground for God's kingdom, you simply try to maintain what you already have. But I've discovered that God isn't a comfort zone God. The Bible calls him a warrior. He likes the front lines, and he has called us into the battle with him to move his kingdom forward. Now, I like the saying, life begins outside of the comfort zone. Why? Because that is where our faith explodes. It won't grow in the comfort zone. It shrinks instead. Why? Because you don't have to use it. You don't see God move because you don't need to. You're depending upon all those things you've erected to keep you safe, comfortable, and secure. Now, I find it interesting that we work so hard surrounding ourselves with so much security, large bank accounts, portfolios, IRAs, insurance for everything, including our pets. And I'm not saying any of that is bad, unless it removes your dependency upon God. See, faith begins and grows when we have to step out and have to trust God, right? F.B. Meyer said, we never test the resources of God until we attempt the impossible. Well, amen. But as long as we're moving only in the realm of our abilities and our resources, faith is unnecessary, isn't it? Need God? Why? I've got this. So listen up. This is so important. This is why God will call us onto those paths that look impossible, paths that have such massive obstacles that they seem impassable. He will lead us up to our personal Red Seas. Now put yourself in the children of Israel's place. They've been oppressed by Egypt, but God sends this man named Moses who tells them God has heard their cries and has seen their misery, and he is going to do something about it. He is going to move them to their own land. Then they watch God force Egypt to her knees with one judgment after another. And finally, it's time. They have their last meal, the Passover meal, and they leave. I mean, how exciting, right? I can just hear them saying to each other, isn't God good? Isn't he faithful? Thank you, Lord, for hearing our cries. Thank you for leading us to our own land. We love you, Lord. But then everything seems to go south. He takes them right up to the banks of the Red Sea, and they're trapped. The Red Sea's in front of them. There are steep mountains to the left and right. Then add to all this, Pharaoh and his army are coming up quickly from the rear. It's an impossible situation. Now what are they saying? Nice leading, Lord. I mean, you've trapped us. We're history. We either drown in the Red Sea or we're slaughtered by Pharaoh and his army. Well done, Lord. Thanks a lot. We trusted you. It would have been better if you just left us alone. But why did God lead them to a place like this? Because he was forcing them to look to him and depend upon him and his abilities and his resources. He was intentionally taking them beyond themselves. And haven't you discovered it is when we face the impossible, that's when Christianity becomes exciting, and that's when our spiritual walk takes off? It's when he disrupts our life and moves us out of the rut and routine of the comfort zone. And like the children of Israel who saw him part the Red Sea and they walked through on dry ground, we see him come through. That's when our faith in him and his ways expands. In the comfort zone, it shrinks. This is when we become thrilled about what he's doing in our life. Armand Geswine said this, when God is about to do something great, he starts with a difficulty. When he is about to do something truly magnificent, he starts with an impossibility. Because that is when our faith grows to the point he can do something magnificent through us. That takes large faith, and we will never have large faith in the comfort zone. We need to be out on those paths of righteousness where we're watching him move on our behalf. So, what have we seen so far? We've seen 3 things that will help us escape spiritual stagnation. Stop focusing on you alone, be willing to stand alone, and stop clinging to the comfort zone. In other words, be willing to take some risk. Be willing to step out into those things where you must depend upon God. That's when you're going to see him move in your life. One more, and this one is so important that the rest will be impossible without it. 4th, we must view life through a biblical lens. This is essential when life gets hard. And can I say, nobody ever promised that life would be easy all the time. It's only the false teachers that promise an easy life, right? Where you're going to be healthy and wealthy all the time. God will give you everything your little heart desires if you just claim it by faith. But God and the Bible are far too honest to lie to us like that. It speaks about trials, testings, and warfare. It speaks of being taken beyond our ability to endure. And let me say that again, because that may have caught your attention. The Bible speaks of being taken beyond our ability to endure. That's important to see, because one of the things I've heard all of my Christian life is this: God will never give us anything more than we can handle. But does the Bible really teach that? Well, I don't think it does. And I think if you ask Paul, he would agree with me. Look at what he says he experienced in 2 Corinthians 1:8 through 9. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. So the truth is, Paul says he was given way more than he thought he could handle. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. Not just a little beyond, but far beyond their ability to endure. But why? Well, look at the last part of verse 9. This is so important. 2 Corinthians 1:9, the last part. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He was led onto a path of righteousness that taught him an invaluable lesson, to stop relying on himself and start relying on God. So, will God give us more than we can handle? Yeah. But now here's what you got to see. It's not more than he can handle. And as those circumstances force us to lean hard upon him, his strength flows into our life, and he ends up lifting us above our natural ability, infusing us with his power so that we can handle the situation. So remember this when you feel like life is overwhelming you. You know what? It probably is. But remember, you've been led onto a path of righteousness, and the difficulties are meant for your good. They're meant to teach you to rely on God in everything. That path is necessary for you to learn how to rest in God. And that leads to resting in those green pastures. Now, to be honest, this is just simple Christianity, isn't it? There's nothing overcomplicated here. It's, God, I choose your will over mine. I choose to follow you. And that choice protects us from the stagnation that is a result of our own will and opens the door for the blessings of Christianity to flow into our life. It puts us onto that path that leads to the abundant life. Now, one more, and then we'll wrap this up, and this will go quick. We are told this is for his name's sake. Psalm 23:3, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. In these days, and probably today too, the state of the flock always reflected on the shepherd's skill. If the sheep were healthy and content, that honored the shepherd. But if they were sickly and anxious, that indicated the shepherd didn't know what he was doing or just didn't care. Now, in the context of this study, when we are surrendered and movable, willing to walk on those paths of righteousness, we are going to be spiritually healthy, and our lives will become a visible representation of how good it is to know God. We will walk in this world filled with stressed out people, exhibiting that peace that passes understanding and filled with the joy that is inexpressible and full of glory. And that brings glory to our shepherd, doesn't it? It is for his name's sake. Well, all right, let's conclude this then. We've seen that stagnation is deadly for spiritual health. So, to disrupt our natural tendencies that can be spiritually unhealthy, our shepherd will keep us moving. He keeps putting us on those paths where we are forced to trust him and where we can grow. But we must allow him to move us, right? Which means we must trust his will and his ways above our own, caring more about what he thinks than what man thinks or even what we think. And we've seen here that obedience is absolutely essential. This is not an option, is it? Our shepherd wants to lead us into those green pastures of blessing and rest, but we've got to follow him. We can't get there if we go our own way. But when we do follow, we will learn by experience that his leading is good. We will become addicted to his will in our life because we will see it is so much better than our own. So as we walk with him and experience the goodness of his will, the blessings there, it's going to become easier and easier to choose his will because we see it just makes sense. Now, I know I've said this many times before probably, but I've been walking with him for over 40 years and I've learned a couple things. I've learned he is brilliant. He never makes a mistake. And I've learned I am not. Sometimes I think I must be the most clueless person ever when it comes to living life. So many times I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, can you relate? But I am so glad I have a loving shepherd that knows what he's doing, who not only keeps digging me out of the problems I create, thank you, Lord, but also is willing to lead me with precision when I'm smart enough to seek him first. The truth is, really, brothers and sisters, we're all sheep, right? And we're all in desperate need of our loving shepherd. And the more we learn to follow him, the more blessed our life will be. Well, all right, guys, I'm so glad you stopped by. Thank you for all your kind words that you put down in the comments section. I read all of them, and I'm just really blessed by the Footnote family. I was telling my wife a couple days ago how much I love you guys. I mean, you're just great. And thank you for your support through prayer and for those of you who are supporting the channel financially. Thank you. The links are in the comment section if you're interested in that. So like I always say, I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.